Okay, so this is looking at section C, the practical-based question. And just like with the data response question, it's really important to read the whole thing really carefully. So in an investigation to compare the elasticity of arteries and veins, rings of the same diameter of artery and vein tissue were cut from blood vessels obtained from a mammal. So they're taking an artery, they're taking a vein, both 20 millimeters, and cutting rings from it. Then they attach that ring to a clamp. Multiple masses of 10 grams were added and removed. The vertical diameter of the artery in the vein was measured, both with the mass and once the mass had been removed. So you can then see that what's going on here. So with no mass, obviously it was 20 millimeters and 20 millimeters across, but with 10 grams, with the vein, it stretched to 26 millimeters and then stayed at 26 millimeters, whereas with the artery, it stretched to 26 millimeters, but then sprang back to 22 millimeters. Okay, so you can sort of start to get a picture of what's going on. So the first question says, say the independent and dependent variables in this experiment. So independent variable is the one we change. Independent variable is the one we change. Dependent one we measure. Okay, so therefore the thing we're changing is this, is the mass. Okay, so that would be the mass. And then the dependent is the diameter of the vein. Okay, so that's the independent and the dependent variable. So then B, let's take one feature of the rings that has to be kept constant apart from their initial diameter. Well, then start to think about it. Well, it needs to be the same animal, it needs to be the same freshness, it needs to be the same width of the ring. Okay, so a few things you could write there. And then part C, explain the differences for the results shown for the vein and the artery. So when we look at the table, we can see that the vein really stretches to a larger diameter and doesn't really spring back very much, whereas the artery doesn't stretch as much and then does spring back relatively close to 20 millimeters each time. So we have to explain, why do we see that? Well, we see that because veins, they have the thinner walls. So that means it's easier to stretch them. So that leads to more stretch. Okay. Also, veins have less elastic fiber. Okay, so that's going to mean that there is, less kind of what we call like the recoil. Okay, and of course you could and that write that up properly, and that is sufficient. And you could do it the other way around. So you could say that arteries have thicker walls, so they stretch less, or arteries have more elastic fibers, so they recover more than the veins do. Okay, and that brings you to the end of your practical-based question.